God bless everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on this Thursday, September 5th, 2024. Tonight, we continue in the foundations of Genesis. We've been working at this for a number of weeks now, and we've moved through so many of the wonderful truths that are important for us to have in our foundation in our Christian lives. The Old Testament is so important for foundation. This is the book that Jesus Christ used as his rule. This is what he had to accomplish. He saw what the prophecies were. He understood the fall of man. He understood all these things we've gone through, the Nephilim, the flood of Noah, the Tower of Babel, and the different difficulties that man came through. The original fall problem was, of course, Adam and Eve fell. And then later on, we had mankind got into dire straits with the Nephilim and the other things that they went through before the flood. And then even after the flood, it wasn't long until people were rebelling again, and he had to confound them with the different languages, which he did at the Tower of Babel. And then the people moved out in different places around the world, and we studied on the descendants of Japheth, which is the oldest, Shem, the believer's line son, and Ham, who was the youngest. And where their descendants went, they had many children, and they went in different places. And the world was populated after the Tower of Babel because the different language groups didn't function as a whole anymore. So they went into their own tribes and groups and settled around the world. But the interesting thing is God doesn't focus on them much. The focus is on his believer's line, and he moves into that rather quickly. Right after we get into the Tower of Babel, we get into studying about Shem, who is the believer's line through Noah, and we start moving on. And we move rather quickly. We're going to go through many generations, and not everybody is listed. We're not going to hear about all of the kids of Noah. We went over some of the details of it, but we're going to learn specifically about Shem to Abraham. And so even in Shem's children, we're not going to talk about all of them. We're going to, the first one that we talk about is Shem's, what seems to be his third born. The third born is actually the one that will carry the believer's line, be the next one after Shem. Shem, and we'll get into that. So if you'll take your Bibles now, we're going to look and finish up Genesis chapter 11. We're going to start in Genesis 10. And so I'll share my screen here with you. You see if I've got Genesis 10 set up here behind the scenes. Or I'm sorry, Genesis 11 we're in. Yeah, I do. And we're going to start in verse 10 here in just a moment. So I'm going to share my screen. Share. Okay, so as usual, we are in the revised English version, and this is what I use consistently, as it is a wonderful version, a Unitarian version, and it's also has wonderful commentary with lots of background. And I use background from the commentary. I've also, tonight, I've used some information I received from Sean Finnegan, who is with Restitutio. I think it's called New Life. He does an extensive amount of classes online. I suggest you avail yourself of them. Also, Andy Woods from an organization called Spirit and Truth, but not the one that you're familiar with. It's just spiritandtruth.org. Abundance of teachings there that you can avail yourself. There's lots of good things that we can read. One of the books that we're talking to people about reading is called Shepherds for Sale. I haven't started it yet, but I talked to John Touchstone this afternoon. He highly recommends it. So I'm probably going to get the audio version and go through that. Also, I'm reading a book called Visions and Dreams, which talks about how Jesus is showing up in places around the world and being involved with bringing Islamic people to the Christian faith. And as we know, lots of things are going on around the world. And so lots of things are going on in the part of the world where Noah and his family landed. And so we're going to start here in chapter 10, and we're going to talk about the descendants of Shem. You see, right before the verse before, therefore its name was called Babel because Yahweh confused the language of all the earth. And from there, Yahweh spread them out over the face of the earth, the whole earth, because when he told them to spread out, Noah said, after he told Noah, he told everybody, be fruitful, multiply, scatter out over the earth, fill the earth. And you know what they said? Well, at least one group, they said no. And so we're going to build something and make a name for ourselves. And God and the divine council didn't care for that. And so we had the Tower of Babel and the confusing of the languages there. Now we move from that. People are spreading out on the whole earth, but now God is going to focus on this particular line. So Shem is one of the three sons of Noah. He happens to be the middle one, Japheth the oldest, Ham the youngest. So now we're going to go into the descendants. So let's read here in verse 10. These are the descendants of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. So Shem's 100, and then 2 years after the flood would be, then Shem would have been 98 during the flood. So 2 years after the flood, he had Archipath. Now we're going to learn that he had some others. This wasn't his first son. Let's go back, if you turn back to Genesis 10, and in verse 22, see here. Okay, in verse 22, it says, Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, there we know he's older, to him were also sons born. The sons of Shem include Elam, Ashur, and here we are, Arpachshad. And then we have Lud and Amram. So he had five sons are listed here. And it seems as if Arpachshad was number 3. Now, of course, that's not guaranteed because sometimes the names are not always listed in chronological order. As we know, oftentimes it's Shem is put first before his other brothers, even though he was not the firstborn. So we're not sure. But anyhow, we're going to talk to him as a believer's line. So that's where the focus is now in Genesis 11. So we'll go back to 11 and we'll continue there. Shem lived 500 years after he fathered Arpachshad, and he fathered sons and daughters. So we just read about the other sons, a total of 5, and daughters, which we don't know about. And so Shem went on to live 500 years after the flood. So when he was 100, he fathered Archipad. And so he was 98 at the flood. So I'm thinking he's around 598 years when he died. Archipath, I could be wrong on that, but I think that's true. Arpachshad lived 35 years, and then he fathered Shelah. Now, first, I always think of Sheila as a girl's name, but it's not. Here we're talking about a guy. He fathered Shelah, and then Archipath lived 403 years after he fathered Shelah, and he also fathered sons and daughters. But we're following this believer's line. Now, Shelah lived 30 years and fathered Eber. And Shelah lived 403 years after he fathered Eber, and then fathered sons and daughters. And we can go back to Genesis 10 if you want to fill in the blanks. It'll tell you the sons, it won't tell you the daughters. Eber lived 34 years and fathered Peleg. And Peleg is always interested because that's when the nations were divided. We talked about him, and we think that was about the time that the Tower of Babel occurred. So it's several generations after Noah. Then Peleg lived 30 years and fathered Ru. Peleg lived 209 years after he fathered Ru, and he fathered sons and daughters. So we're just following the believer's line here. You can see the different names. Ru lived 32 years and fathered Serug. Ru lived 207 years after he fathered Serug, and he fathered sons and daughters. Then Serug lived 30 years and fathered Nahor. Now, Nahor is going to come up again here a little bit later. Yes. And Serug lived 200 years after he fathered Nahor, and he fathered sons and daughters. And then Nahor lived 29 years and fathered Terah. Now, Terah is going to be a pretty famous name here really quick. Nahor lived 119 years after he fathered Terah, and he fathered sons and daughters. So Terah lived 70 years, and here we've got Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. So now we're getting into some people that are going to be talked about more. All right, so these guys, when we read this here where it says Terah lived 70 years and fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, of course, we're not assuming these guys are triplets. And we don't really know. This is when he first started fathering the children. And we're going to get into putting a little more information on this. We're going to study here and see if we can get some years and names as best we can. Like this verse, it says Noah was 500 years old and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That doesn't mean he had them all at once. The names are not always in chronological order, and we have to work the scripture if we're going to get the details. So Terah's firstborn son was born when he was 70. So we got one being born at 70, but we're not told which is the firstborn. Now, Terah was 130 years old when Abram was born. So there were 60 years between the firstborn son and Abram, but we don't know who the firstborn son was. It could have been these other two. It could have been Nahor or Haran. So we just know after the firstborn son, 60 years passed by, and then Abram was born. Now we can calculate the birth of Abraham. The year Terah died was the same year that Abraham left. Now, you know the thing about, you're going to hear me jump back and forth, and I'm going to be saying Abram and Abraham. They're the same person. I think we all know that. Abram was his name originally, then God changed it to Abraham later. And the same thing's going to can occur here in a verse or two with Sarai. So he left for the promised land. Genesis 11:32. Let's kind of scroll down here. Says the days of Terah were 205. So Terah died at 205 years of age. And in Genesis 12:4, jump over here, look at Genesis 12:4. It says, so Abraham went just as Yahweh had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So we're getting some ages together here. So when he left for the promised land, we got 75 when he left for the promised land. Terah was 205 when he died. So 205 minus 75 equals 130, which would have been the age of Terah when Abraham was born. So now we can put together these facts. And this is kind of a wonderful way that the scripture oftentimes won't tell you everything in one spot, that you can move around and you can find these things and see how the word fits together and how it's really kind of fun to do that. Okay, we know very little about what happened between the time of Adam and Noah's flood. We know the flood occurred over 1,600 years. I'll stop sharing here for a moment. I'll go back to 11. We know that the flood, it was approximately 1,600 years after, because we've gone through the chronology. It's 1,640 some, I'm not sure the exact day, that the flood occurred after Adam and Eve. But we don't know a whole lot about in between. We know some stuff. We know about Cain and Abel, right? And we do know that certain skills were developed. Cain was a farmer. He brought the grain offering, right? And then we know that Abel was apparently a sheep herder because he brought the animal sacrifice. So farming and ranching were done between those times, and they knew about sacrifice. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us about specific sacrifices, other than we know animals had to be sacrificed to get the hides to for Adam and Eve to wear. So we just don't know a whole lot, but we do know that we know those things, records in the Old Testament in this time. We know that bronze making and iron making was being done. We know that a few musical instruments were developed. The lyre was developed, the flute was developed, and it seems that the people were very intelligent. I would say probably surprisingly intelligent to our standards because they're very close to Adam and Eve in more of the genetically pure human race line, you know. And then so we have this jump into the flood, and then we have a convolution, a kind of funneling of genetics, and things change fairly rapidly after the flood. As you can see, there's pretty precipitate drop in how long people live after the flood. Now, who knows? I mean, we don't know the environment before the flood. I have an idea the air was clean, you know, maybe there's the oxygen content might have been different, the food might have been different, more variety, don't know. But things were different before the flood, but they just dropped pretty quickly. And as you saw, just that line of descendants, that they had been going down pretty fast. So they were smart, very smart. Of course, technologically, they weren't so smart. That kind of developed much later on. Okay. So the Bible only takes 11 chapters to describe this period of 1600 years. But the Bible focuses on the development of this one family that goes from Seth through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's 12 sons and their children, and ends up with the Exodus. And then after the Exodus, God deals with Israel as a nation. So God spends very little time on other nations. You know, you can read the Bible. It doesn't talk about what's happening in China. It doesn't talk about what's happening in North and South America. He doesn't focus on it. He focuses on what's important. And this is the coming into Israel as a nation. And that's where the Christ will come from. So his focus is on that. And sadly, the adversary's focuses is also on that as well. That's why we saw so much stuff we're going to see more. But that's what we're now, later on, when we get into Moses and things like that. So, and now we're back to, let's go back to, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to start sharing. We're going to go back to Genesis chapter 11, and in verse 27, we'll take up with the record here. And, okay. And I said, it's 27. Okay. Now, so we've gone over the 70 years, and he fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Now, these are the descendants of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Now, Haran, which would have been Abraham's brother, right, fathered Lot. Now, that's going to come up. Everybody's pretty well familiar with Lot. So Lot would have been Abraham's what? His nephew. You said nephew, you were right. Haran died before his father. Now, this is very interesting. It's kind of a very sad thing, too, because this is the first time in a record of a child dying before a parent. And so this goes to show that as things progressed after the flood, we deal with a lot of these things get different, and some of the things get more hurtful in life. And it's interesting that God wanted this in the scripture, that Haran died before his father Terah. This is the first time we see this in the land of his birth, which is Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham and Nahor took wives. Now, the name of Abram's wife was Sarai. Now, Sarai, as you know, is going to have her name changed. So, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So, Terah also fathered at least one girl, and her name was Sarai, and Sarai became Abraham's wife. So we end up with Sarai being the half sister of Abram. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, who was also the father of Ishcal. So as we follow this, we don't know what Terah's wife's name was. We do know that Abraham took a wife of Sarah and Nahor took a wife of Milcah. And so the daughter of Haran, Milcah was the daughter of Haran. So we're getting this family stuff going on here, and you're going to see that there are half sisters and nieces, nephews are marrying each other here. Sarai was barren and had no child. And of course, this becomes a very big deal. Now, Sarai is going to get her name changed to Sarah later on. Okay. Nahor and Milcah had let's see, I think that's coming up next, so I'll just read it. Abraham took wives, we read that, and okay, Sarah was barren. Terah took Abraham his son, Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son's wife. So Terah is going to take Abram. Now, what's happening here is that Terah takes Abraham. Now, we know that God called Abram, but according to the tradition, the eldest was the head of the tribe. So that's why Terah is being, it looks like he is being the one who's heading this thing up. They went from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan, but they went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205. So I've got some details I want to fill in. We'll go back here that Abraham's son Isaac ends up let's go on further. Nahor and Milcah had a son named Bethuel who gave birth to Rebekah and Laban. And so you may be very familiar with Rebekah and Laban. Uncle Laban and Rebekah. Rebekah is the father of Jacob. And so these generations are very close. Abraham's son Isaac married Nahor's granddaughter, Rebekah. And as you know, Rebekah gave birth to twins, Jacob and Esau. So Jacob and Esau were the grandchildren of Abram. These are all closely related. Jacob married Laban's two daughters, remember? And we'll get into Laban. He ran a very shrewd deal with his two daughters, and he was a little bit tricky of Jacob. And they had 12 sons, and these 12 sons eventually became the 12 tribes of Israel. We're going to develop this as we go through Genesis. And then, of course, we know Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So it's interesting to note that all of Jacob's children were great grandchildren of Abram. So later on, as we go into detail, we'll learn that 8 of the tribes of Israel descended through Terah, and that would be 6 through Leah, which would have been Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, and Issachar, and Zebulun. And then 2, as you know, came from Rachel, which were Joseph and Benjamin. And you probably remember that she died after giving birth to Benjamin. So 4 of the tribes came from Dan, which came from concubines of Jacob, which were Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. They were all born to Jacob through concubines. We'll get into all the details, but these are going to be important, and God's going to develop these as we go through these different records. So let's go back here, I think in 28, Ellen. Yeah. Okay. I think I handled that just fine. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about this Ur of the Chaldees keeps coming up. They went from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. but they went as far as Haran and settled there. And the days of Terah were 205, and Terah died in Haran. Well, God called Abraham to go to Canaan. So why did they settle there? Now, it ends up, if you do the math, we can do that, but I'll do that in just a minute. And we can figure out that they were there 5 years. And so people, you might say, well, why? Why 5 years and why did they stop there? Well, Terah was old. He was 200 years old. He was the leader of the group, and their respect and love for him most likely just got too tired, too weak for the travel. They're walking and they walk a long way. Sometimes they ride camels, we know that. But I think it makes a lot of sense that the reason they settled in Terah, you think, well, why did they do that? Because it's very clear that Abraham was called to go to Canaan, and he was. So what we think happened there was just a time where the guy got old, he was weak, and they just needed to stop. And so they just cared for him and lived out the rest of his days with him. And then he gets called again. But let's take a look here. Some of these, we've got some things to clear up in history. I'm going to share my screen here. And we're going to take a look at, let's see, it's right behind here. Got a couple maps I want to show you. The traditional route. So first of all, let's just lay it all out here. Here's the Mediterranean. Now here's Israel. And we've got in this area, and Shechem. We've talked about Shechem from the Bible Lands tour. And so we have this, we go all the way over here, and traditionally this was said to be Ur of the Chaldees. Now this is being disputed now, because this is like 150 miles from the Persian Gulf. This is way out there. Now you can probably see the Euphrates River here and the Tigris. So we're in the Iraq area, because if you remember when we went over to Tower of Babel, it was actually located in what is present day Iraq. Now, if you see this name here, you know the Assyrians. They eventually will attack Israel and conquer the northern tribes. Later on, down in here, going to have the Babylonians, and they're going to attack later on and take Judah. Now, as you remember from the map and the aerial view, we saw the remains of what is believed to be the Tower of Babel near Babylon, when this is all Iraq right now. So you think, well, why, if God called Abraham to go to Canaan, and here's Canaan over here, see Canaan? Now, Canaan is the name of one of Ham's firstborn son, and usually land names, especially shortly after the flood, were oftentimes named after people. So you might know, you've heard of Moab, was named after Moab. Edom was named after Esau. And you have other places named after people. So it was his call to come to Canaan, and here he comes out of Ur. And so he heads on up to Haran. Now, why would he do that? Because that's where they lived those 5 years we just talked about. This is kind of out of the way, isn't it? Now, we know this is a great desert, so they don't just go straight across it. But they could have cut through on one of these routes over here and just head on down, saving a lot of miles off of those poor feet as they were walking. So they've done a lot of excavation here, and so they thought they had found it. But now historians are finding this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It seems like, and there has been another Ur found. Now, on most maps, it's called Urfa, and the new name is called Edessa. But this is the Ur that we think is really the Ur of Abraham's time, and it really makes a lot more sense. So if you're in Ur of the Chaldees and you need to go to Canaan, it's a pretty not so difficult trip. You just go a little bit to the west and you just head south. And then there was some back and forth stuff. And so we have these two Urs. So these two different maps are helping us see. The traditional Ur of the Chaldees is in this far southeast area. and close to the Persian Gulf in the Babylonian Empire, while the closer Ur is in the northwest, and it's just about 30 miles north of Haran. So here you have Haran, and you have 20 or 30 miles north of Haran. And this is also called Edessa. It's kind of like Odessa, only it's with an E, Edessa, or it's also called Urfa. It's Urfa, but we just call it Ur. So these are the more modern names. So this man named Victor Hamilton, he offers 7 arguments as to why the northeastern Ur is more likely for the Ur of Abraham. For one thing, it's just such a long journey from this the traditional Ur all the way over to Canaan. It's illogical that they would have gone all the way up to Haran here before going when they could have cut across. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Uh, so Canaan, there are many reasons that the REV commentary goes over many of these reasons. So if this is of interest to you, I'll suggest that you go into the commentary on these verses here in the latter part of Genesis 11, and you can read to your heart's content. There's all kinds of good arguments on to why it should be. Now, one of the arguments against it is that when there was the stoning of Stephen, and before he was teaching, he said in Acts 7:2 about Abraham coming from Mesopotamia. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and we're going to go back to our Bibles, and let's turn to Genesis, or actually, we're going to go to Acts. Let me open up another one here. Let's take a look in Acts, and Acts chapter 7. Acts 7 and in verse 2, and I'll start sharing again. I think I haven't been sharing. Here we're going to share. And so in Acts 7:2, and he said, men and brothers and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, get out of your land and away from your relatives and come to the land I will show you. And he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And when his father was dead, God moved him from there into the land in which you now live. He's talking to the people of Israel. So we have this, people sometimes will say, well, it's Mesopotamia, and Babylon is in Mesopotamia. But Mesopotamia also goes all the way up to Eastern Turkey. So that's not a good argument as to why it should be in the traditional Ur. So the land of Canaan, we've got that probably named after Canaan, the son of Ham, and that was pretty typical that they settled that way. And a lot of these different country names are going to come from these descendants. As I mentioned earlier, Ur and Haran is approximately 20 to 30 miles apart. And as I showed you on the map, this area right here, maybe 20 to 30 miles. Some people think it's 30. And so we know about this thing about, it looks like it just makes perfect sense. So what happened was Terah, Abraham's father, was one who took the clan from Ur to Haran, and the culture dictated that Terah was the father clan, and therefore he's the leader of the group, and explains why it's stated that way. And then the Bible doesn't give us the reason for sure why the family settled in Haran, but we think it was Terah was very old, as I mentioned, and they needed to settle there because he was going to pass away. So we know that he stayed in Haran for 5 years, because from the call of Abraham to the Exodus, and this is going to get a little bit detailed, but the call of Abraham to the Exodus was 430 years. And that's stated in Exodus 12:40, if you'd like to read that sometime. And we know that Abraham was called from Ur in the Chaldeans. So Abraham was 75 when he left to Haran to go to the promised land. And that's stated in Genesis 12:4, we read it. And he was 100 when Isaac was born. We read that too. And furthermore, we know that the length of time between Abraham's seed Isaac and the Exodus was 400 years. That's in Genesis 15:13 and in Acts 7:6. But if there were only 400 years from Isaac to the Exodus and 30 years from Abraham's call to the Exodus, then the call had to predate the birth of Isaac by 30 years. So that's 5 years before Abraham left Haran. And that would mean Abraham was called to go to the promised land at age 70 when Terah was 200 and the family traveled to Haran, at which point we assume that he was just too old and weak to travel. So the family stayed there for 5 years, and Sarah died at 2005. So that takes us to the end of Genesis 11:32. And Terah was 205 years old when he died there in Haran. Now I want to I'll finish that part up, and we're going to just completely jump horses here. So I hope you're flexible, because we're going to go from I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to go from these verses in Genesis 11, and I want to share, over these months, over these last number of weeks, probably several months now, we've got into so much detail through the creation story, through the whole period of time with Adam and Eve, the fall, the flood, and we've studied much detail. And I'm not going to go over this stuff again because I think we've handled some of the things more than once. But there are certain things that I think that would be, I'm just going to pull out and I'm going to show you some things that I think will be very interesting to you. I've been promising this for a long time. And so now I'm getting around to it. Now, one thing I want to tell you, I have written a paper on this, and it's that it actually summarizes so much of the stuff we've done for these last weeks, dealing with Genesis, the creation story, fossils, the age of the earth, all these different things. And I've capsulized it into one paper, and it's going to have links, and I'm going to give this to you. So after the teaching, when I send out, I'll be sending something out shortly. I'm going to send everybody a PDF that has so much of the stuff that we've gone over in a concise form, because this whole thing, the goal was that we would know what the word says, and we would have arguments when people would say, this doesn't make sense with science. And people and kids in school today are now turning from the word because they go to school. The earth was 1,000,000 years old. What do you mean Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago? Well, fossils, dinosaurs, they're 68 million years old. What do you mean? They were formed on the 6th day of creation. So you have so much unbelief that have been caused by what scientists have. And so what I have endeavored to do, and I think I have done, at least in part, is to give you some hard evidence as to how science can fit with the Bible. You do have to make some changes. You maybe had believed that the earth was millions of years old. Maybe it is millions of years old, but it doesn't have to be. We talked about the gap theory between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, right? The earth was created, the heaven and the earth were created, and they became without form and void, and darkness upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved on the faces of the water, and God said, let there be light. How much time occurred from the time that it was made perfectly until the time he said, let there be life? We don't know. Was it 20,000 years? Was it longer? We don't know. But it doesn't have to be millions of years. So what happened back in the 1700s and 1800s, James Hutton, and later with the help of Sir Charles Lyell, rejected the biblical record that was popularized in the 1830s. And so this was they said, we've got to get Moses out of science, was one of the statements that they said. Because up until then, your scientists believed in the creation. They believed what God said. Most of them. There was a change in the 1700s and 1800s. Mainly, you can lay the problem at the foot of Lyell, who was not really an historian. He was an attorney. And he started presenting that the earth had to be millions of years old. And guess who was excited about that? Charles Darwin, because he needed time to make evolution plausible. So Lyell and Darwin actually became friends. So Darwin needed the Earth to be ancient to make his theories believable. So we're told that dinosaurs existed 65 million years ago before they suddenly became extinct. So how does that fit with the Bible? Well, first of all, dinosaurs themselves is a coined word that came about in 1841. This is when dinosaurs was first talked about by Richard Owens. He was a British paleontologist, and it just simply means, and you've heard me say this before, terrible lizard. Now, because dinosaurs have been used, they're almost like a distinct group of animals, but all they are terrible lizards. And most dinosaurs fall into the category of lizards. Some of them are very large, some of them are man eaters, some of them are not. And we've talked about the ideas on the possibility of why they could be man eaters. Most of them have perpendicular legs to their bodies. They lay eggs. They lived on land, two holed behind their eye sockets, allowing for jaws that could open wide, clamped down with much force. They were manipulated beings. And it seems as though that these beings could have been manipulated about the same time that the adversary was manipulating the female egg to produce the Nephilim. The Nephilim were large and evil, and a lot of the dinosaurs were large and evil. And as we know, these populations grew to make Earth really uninhabitable by anyone who wanted to be righteous. You had these, and so God spared Noah and his family, and they did the ark and they left, and the others were all destroyed in the flood. So sometimes, the thing is, well, what happened to the dinosaurs? And what I used to believe was that dinosaurs existed back in the gap. That makes perfect sense. We'll put them in the gap. And that kind of seemed to make sense, but I've got something here that I think we need to consider. So we know about in Genesis, Adam and Eve sinned, and the consequences of that sin was the whole creation changed. And we know in Romans 8:22, you don't have to look at it, for we know the whole creation has been groaning together and suffering in the pains of childbirth together right up into the present time. So we know that's going on right now. And we know that death first occurred after Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve, everything was fine. They were made to live forever as long as they did not sin. Everything was supposed to move that direction. But once they sinned, then death entered the world. And so that's, if you'll take a look at Romans chapter 5, let's turn to that. I'm going to stop sharing. And we're going to go into, well, I'm not sharing anyhow. We're going to go into Romans chapter 5. And Romans chapter 5. And I'm going to look at 5b. I'm sorry, 12b. Okay. And I'll start sharing again. And in Romans chapter 5, 12b, and it needed for this reason, just as through one man sin entered to the world, and death through sin, and also death spread to all humankind, for all have sinned. So we're seeing here that through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. So we knew from Genesis that the ground was cursed, plant life changed, thorns developed, as we read earlier on. And let's take a look. We're going to go back to Genesis in chapter 3. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 17. And Adam said, and to Adam he said, because you have listened to your wife's voice and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, saying you must not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In pain and toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat plants. You will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face will you eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken, for you are dust, and dust you will return. So we have this cursing of the ground. And so we also have this verse here in Romans 5b that says, death entered into the world through sin. So when you think about what happened to the dinosaurs, we've got a problem here. The dinosaurs died. And so how could they have died if death hasn't entered the world until Adam and Eve? So this is a real problem for gap theorists, because in the gap theory, you have death, right? And you have all kinds of things occurring that seem like those are the kinds of things that occurred after the fall and not before. So I'm going to show you a couple of photos here. This is going to be, I think, interesting to you. Okay, I'll share my screen. First of all, let me, I'll share my screen. And you may have seen this, so it might not be too surprising. Okay, what we have here is a fossil. And if you look closely, what do you have here? You have a fish eating a fish, and it's a fossil. So if this couldn't have happened in the gap, this indicates that this fossil occurred was caused by the flood. And so these animals at the time of the flood were eating each other, which makes sense because death had entered into the world. And that death was entered by Adam and Eve. So up until then, there's no record of any death. The first deaths recorded were those of whatever animals that God killed to produce the skins for Adam and Eve to wear out of the Garden of Eden. So you have this one particular evidence that things that doesn't seem like that could have occurred in any time of a gap theory here. And then you have this. I'll expand that. And this is some planet vegetation. Here's a stem here, leaves, and here's a thorn. Well, thorns and thistles did not occur until the cursing of the land after Adam and Eve sinned. So this all indicates to me that this occurred after Adam and Eve sinned. So God made all the animals on the sixth day, including mankind. I think somewhere on the fifth day. I have to check that out. But he made them later on in the restoration week. And then he made man and woman after that. So reptiles were made on the sixth day. And all these animals, plants were made previous to that, but they had no thorns. So this could not be billions of years old, because thorns did not exist until around 6,000 years ago, if the Bible is correct, and it is. Then we have, these are some fossils of bones, and it's kind of hard to point this out, but these are cancerous bones. So you have diseases in fossils. And these fossils are said to be millions and millions of years old. But we didn't have diseases, which are just death in part, until Adam and Eve fell. So this seems to be good evidence that these could not be previous to the 6-week restoration story in Genesis. They had to be after that. And for those of you, when we were in 2 or 3 years ago, I was in Atlanta or outside of Atlanta with some of the leadership of STF, and I'd been working with John Shainheit talking about this type of stuff for a long time. And I presented basically what the main points out of this paper that I'm going to give to you in 5 minutes during dinner. John, I said, hey, John, I got to run something past you. I want to see if this fits with you. And so I went through very quickly through Genesis, and I talked to him about the thorns and thistles, gap theory, how death didn't occur until the sin of man. And I went on through fossils are not millions of years old. He says, yes, they've already debunked that. Fossils are not millions of years old. That's all figured out by wrong assumptions on carbon dating. And so I just went all the way through it. And I said, Nephilim, dinosaurs, same period of time, looks like there's same genetic manipulation. And I went a little bit more thoroughly, but I probably did in about 5 minutes. And the director of STF was there too. His name escapes me right now. He did a teaching just a couple of weeks. But I said, John, what do you think of that logic? And he says, the logic is unflawed. That's how I see it too. So I needed to because this is a little bit extreme in some senses because the scientific world would just say, I am absolute idiot. What is wrong with you? Everything's old. But there's some more evidence here. And so I'm going to share this last little tidbit here, which I think is very interesting. I want to share my screen. Mary Schweitzer. Has anyone heard of Mary Schweitzer? I know Jim has. Maybe a few other you had. So she is a scientist and she works on fossils and she does experiments with fossils all day long. This is her thing. And she made a discovery. And it's surprisingly how few people know about this, but you guys have probably heard 60 Minutes. Remember the old TV show 60 Minutes? Yeah, well, I'm going to play something from 60 Minutes here. So let me cue this up. And I'm going to share this. And you should be able to see that now. And I'm going to play it. There it is.
What happened next happened by mistake. Mary put some fragments of the bone in acid to dissolve away the outermost layer of mineral. But the acid worked too fast and all the mineral dissolved away. Being a fossil, there should have been nothing left. But there was. And it was elastic, like living tissue.
This is the piece.
No. She showed us video she took under the microscope.
That's really what happened?
Yes.
That's the dinosaur bone?
Without mineral now. That's what was left.
It looked like the soft tissue she would have expected to find if it had been modern bone. This was impossible. This bone was 68 million years old.
So you see this and you think, what? You
I didn't want to tell anybody.
You'd be ridiculed,
Yes.
right?
And so I said to my technician, okay, do it again. I don't believe it.
And yet, in sample after sample, they were there. Things that looked suspiciously like flexible, transparent blood vessels. She finally mustered the courage to tell Jack.
She said she dissolved the bone away and there were blood vessels. And, I was like shocked. I mean,
How could that be?
How could that be? That's right.
The things Mary was finding inside dinosaur bones,
Look at that.
blood vessels, and even what seemed to be intact cells, pose a radical challenge to the existing rules of science, that organic material can't possibly survive even 1 million years, let alone 68 million. Mary, Jack, and their team published their B-Rex findings in a series of papers in the journal Science and were promptly attacked. Critics said their samples might have been contaminated, or that the supposed blood vessels were actually something called biofilm, a type of slime. But as Mary showed us, she's been able to replicate her findings. These are pieces of an even older dinosaur, a well-preserved 80-million-year-old duckbill. When she dissolved it away in acid...
Let's put this under the scope here.
Well, look. Is that a blood vessel?
This is a blood vessel.
You're
You
kidding.
see the branches right there? And look at all of them. And it's so consistent over and over and over again. We do this bone and it comes out and I get excited every time. I can't help it. I mean, 80 million years old.
Mary published her new results last year, and while some of her critics have been swayed, the controversy still rages, and the stakes are high. If blood vessels can survive 80 million years, what about DNA?
Okay. All right. So that's kind of interesting. I think that kind of was shocked a lot of the world of fossils. Of course, what occurred after that is this is kind of the thing changed a little bit. What happened was she told it, people criticized her, and then the response from the scientific community just came back saying, yes, we weren't aware of it, but there are preservation techniques that can make soft bone last for 80 million years. Now, who buys that? So they had to come up with something. Oh yeah, we were pretty sure all along that maybe something like this would happen, but that's not what they said at first. Now she's not the only one. I can it's running late now, but I've got several other videos that they're finding this all over the place. This is now soft fossil material. How can it be 80 million years old and still be soft? Well, it can't be 80 million years and still be soft, but it can be around 6,000. Actually, at the time of the flood, which we know is 1,600 years. So what is that? 4,400 years ago. That makes a lot more sense. So it took me a while. I used to be, I've had to change my thinking. This has taken me a process or 10 years at least to move from where I was to where I am now. And you may have trouble with believing this, and that's okay. There's lots of ideas. There's probably 8 different ways to look at the creation stories and fossils, and I'm going to give you links to other people that have different ideas on it. And I've listened to those ideas, but this seems to be the best that answers the most questions. And when you got little kids talking about fossils, you can say, well, fossils just were made about 4,400 years ago. You can tell your kids, grandkids, you've got something, and I'll give you this paper. You can read over it. You can show them the movies. You can let them read stuff. And if people are really interested in believing the Bible and rejecting some of the scientific claims that are not true, you have some evidence here. And I think you can help people. We've got this path of people that our kids are being taught in school that there really is no God, that millions of years we came from amoebas, and we've got a mess here, and it keeps getting worse. And we have kids, grandkids, great grandkids we love, and we don't want them to fall into that. And we have friends that we love. And I think this is what I'm hoping, that this first part of the foundations in Genesis, and why I've taught it for so many weeks, was to give you ammunition, because the Bible says we are supposed to be able to give a reason for the hope that lies within us. We need to be able to answer questions. We need to not just say, oh, just take it by blind faith. Oh, the pastor said so and so. No, you can really do this if you want. So I'll send this out to you. I'll probably send it out to everybody on our list, and I'll send it out as PDF. And Claire, I know you don't print stuff, so I'll send it to you in the mail. And would you like that, Claire? Would you like a copy in the mail? Okay. All right. And I think Janice Erickson, she is probably in the same situation. So if you know of anyone that doesn't do PDFs and printing machines and would rather just for me to print it out and mail it, I'll be delighted to do that. I couldn't do it. That'd be you'd make my day, if you wanted this by mail, any way you want it, because I think it's really so important. So, Heavenly Father, Lord Jesus Christ, we are delighted to be a part of your children. Thank you for this interesting night here of teaching, going from Shem to Abraham to stretchy fossils. Your word is just filled with so many things, and we just want to glorify you, God. We know you are the one true God, you and you alone. You are the creator of the heavens, earth, seas, streams, and all that is in them. Anything that is not good has been manipulated by the adversary. You are a good God, and we want you represented well. We do not want your name taken in vain, meaning that things that you didn't do are blamed on you. We want the truth, and we know that you honor this teaching, you honor the truth, and you'll help spread it to those people that it will benefit. So thank you for a wonderful night tonight, for a good night's sleep for everybody, especially for Brad tonight, and for a wonderful weekend coming up with family and friends, and or however you want to spend it. Just bless your people here tonight. Thank you for this time to share the word in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
AJ,